Hi, I have more books for you. 7 today, and we will, without further ado, leap in and start with, I've got 2 small, 2 crime, 2 history, and a romantic one in the middle. First one up, Max Porter's Shy. This comes to us from Faber, and Shy actually is the name of the main character in this book, who is a young man who's a little bit troubled, seriously troubled, and this whole book follows his, I think it's just one evening when he has been with this unspecified sort of, it's kind of the cacophony of the world inside his head and how he and the world don't really fit together. He eventually finds himself in a school at about, you feel that he's just at the end of high school age. He has been put in a school called the Last Chances School. And when the story opens, he's actually trying to sneak out with a rucksack full of stones. And he is making his way into the dark, dark night, which is in a lot of ways sort of symbolic for the abyss as what is the inside of his head. And he is a boy who suffers from night terrors, so it's an interesting little journey, him going out into that. You feel a little bit Virginia Woolfian, he's with his bag of rocks on his back, and you wonder, he's heading towards the pond vaguely, so you're wondering what's going to happen next, and I think Shy himself is wondering what's going to happen next. This is Max Porter at doing what we know he loves doing, but there was something about this one that pulled me in quite strongly, because you sort of live inside this young man's head. It's very musical. It's a book that works on beat and on rhythm. As you know, Porter plays with form and he plays with text. So sometimes he has words that make a funny shape on the paper, funny shape, are shaped differently, like we saw with Lehane. His poetics are exceptional. He's very interested in sound and rhythm, and this one particularly, it has those big words of sort of the angry and horrible things people may have said to him, and the little words of what he says to himself, and then bits of dialogue from how the people in this Last Chances School, who are really behavioural therapists, the way they talk to him. It's a very lovely read about helping, but it's also a very interesting read about how he's sort of... there's an onslaught of sound and of what this makes him do. It's an absolutely fabulous read. It's not all horrible. There's this kind of warp of when was this said, so time becomes a little bit blurry. The voice of today and the voice of what his parents said to him and how he looked at himself, they all get very jumbled up. And there's even this warp of people, the things that seep through time, in even the room he's in, that he feels has been inhabited by someone else, and he thinks he sees that person. It's an absolutely tremendous read. It's also a small read, which I love, but comes to us from Faber as an absolute stunner. Another short one, which comes to us, this is Sophie MacKintosh's Cursed Bread, comes to us from Hamish Hamilton. Sophie MacKintosh was longlisted for the water cure, and this one I had heard about because it is based on a historical fact of a mass poisoning in a small town in rural France, and occurred in the 1950s. And this is a very strange, hypnotic, almost kind of lethargic, drugged read. And it was, my takeaway from this book is I almost felt I was reading it as if I had been in part poisoned by whatever affected the people of this town. It's told to us from the point of view of Elodie, who is the wife of the village baker. She herself is a kind of an outcast. So we're dealing with who are the outcasts who infiltrates a town. Some of the sort of lighter moments are what occurs around the moment of doing the laundry. So we are, again, highly metaphorical, but we are dealing with Elodie sort of, some of them are washing the clothes of other people, and it's how they kind of connect to each other. Elodie is sexually frustrated. Basically, her husband is no longer really interested in her, and we find out a bit more about that. But it's not the point of the story. The point of the story is this very glamorous, hypnotic couple who wander, who sail in, and tell all sorts of stories about themselves. They're fabulists. They're also narcissists. And Elodie gets caught up in their machinations, and you never really know what's true and what's not true. She tells stories to them, they tell stories to her, and in the end, it kind of builds into a sort of a moment of hysteria that's never sharp or pointy. It's always a bit sort of dreamy. It's an astonishing read. I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it. Well worth a foray into, for looking at what experimental fiction is being written. It's astonishingly good. Next one, we have Curtis Sittenfeld's romantic comedy. Again, these very good writers will be looking at what we can do with genre, with form, with where a narrative goes, all of that. She's looking at the kind of the genre of and the trope of romantic comedy in this. And it's also a romantic comedy in and of itself. So she's got kind of a double layer going on. I forgot to say, yes, this one is from Doubleday. We have a young woman called Sally. I've got these in the wrong order. No, Sally Mills. And she has kind of given up on love. She writes for The Night Owls, which is a late night comedy show. She doesn't believe anymore that there is this sort of true love, but she has noticed, partly from watching to her sort of a once predictable but sort of difficult to believe hookup of a fellow writer, Danny, who, if you like, ensnares this very glamorous, very beautiful woman. And she's looking at this kind of trope of how come it's okay to have the hot girl, you know, linking up with the not so hot, maybe nerdy, but funny guy. And Sally's convinced that the opposite would not be true, that you won't get the funny, nerdy girl hooking up with the really hot guy. Hence, we get the really hot guy who turns up. So Sally's the funny, nerdy one. He's the hot guy called Noah. He's a bit of a celebrity rock star, and he's really genuinely quite nice. The book's in 3 parts, and in the first part is kind of this introductory part to what she does. The second part is she's met Noah. There's an epistolary romance, which I just love. And in the last bit, it's, you know, you get to a part where Sally's sort of looking at this Noah person and saying this is never going to work, or will it? And what I like about Sittenfeld is she creates a very believable woman. We understand her cynicism, we understand her sarcasm, we also understand that she's not a cliche, because this is successful, she's professional, she makes a good living, she doesn't actually need a man. And this gives this story a lot of backbone. And Noah's just really nice, which, you know, we all like. So those are our 3 parts. Playing with this, playing with the form, playing with this character, and waiting to see, can Sally kind of stop obstructing her own path to happiness, or is this her path to happiness? You will have to read it to find that out. Now we're going to move into some of the thrillery, crimey ones. The first one up today is Michelle Prak's The Rush, and I read this in a bit of a rush. It comes to us from, before I make a mistake, Simon & Schuster, Australia. Look, it's an outback sort of noir. It's more of an outback road trip. It's an absolute cracker in that, I mean, I picked it up and said, okay, where's she going to go with this? And before I knew it, I was over halfway through. It's one of those escapist reads, and you are getting quite tense. We have, the way I would look at it is we have a location. We're up in the Northern Territories, and we have this location which is a pub. It's a destination pub, so people know to come here. And this is run by Matt and Andrea. They have a young son, and Matt is kind of more used to outback living than Andrea would be. But she's doing pretty well and is not necessarily hostile to it, and she's determined to make a go of this. So there are, this is our kind of our central location, apart from being out on the road trip. We also have a young girl, Quinn, whose family home is being sold, and she's packing it up slowly, and she works for them. And when our story starts, Quinn is driving over to the Pindery, this pub, and the rains have begun, and she comes across a body, not a dead one, a live one, on the road, and it's someone who needs help. Then we go to the road trip bit where we have 4 young students, and this is what Prak does so exceptionally well, is she gets into the mind of the young person. So we have a couple who are not really doing so well. We've got Hannah and Scott. Scott's very nerdy online all the time, and she's much more invested, you feel, in the relationship than he is. It's all a bit sort of, you know, he sort of seems to be humouring her by continuing this relationship. And she says, well, look, we need to get one road trip in before we hit our careers seriously and before life gets too serious. To make it work financially, they sort of interview people to take the other seats in the car. So we get a young woman, Livia, who comes from Brazil, and she's a little bit glamorous. She's into environmental activism, and she's sort of the same age group. And a young man called Schuster, who comes from the Netherlands. He's an engineer, maybe a little bit geeky, kind of quite organized. He's an engineering student, so he knows systems and stuff. And they seem to make a fairly good quartet. But as things go on, you find that this becomes very fractious. They don't get on as well as they did, and they're simply not prepared for the one element, which is one of the elements, the rains. Now, the rains have come, and the rains aren't going to stop. Matt has left the pub to go and help a neighbour, as you do. The bikies who have just left the pub and were a little bit, you know, you wondered, were they going to be troublesome? Some of them have come back to the pub because the rains don't look good. Andrea is on her own because Quinn hasn't arrived. And then some of these backpackers will begin to turn up, and it just goes to pot. It's fabulous. She does, Prak, she does deal with the preoccupations of being a young adult, of the concerns, of the way they talk to each other, of the games they play with each other, the kind of the pranks, what's funny, what's not funny, what happens online. Excellent, excellent writing. A real escapist read. On a very different note, but still a thriller, we have Dennis Lehane, Small Mercies. Now this one comes to us from Abacus Books. Lehane, some of you will probably know, wrote Mystic River and Shutter Island. So we know that his plotting is already exceptional. I mean, this man is a plotting master. He's also, on a sentence level, very, very hard to beat. What he is doing in this particular one is quite astonishing. He has, I mean, from the opening pages, I heard the voice of Mary Pat Fennessy, a poor Irish, American Irish woman living in a sort of, like a white Irish American sort of, not ghetto, an enclave, if you like, called the Southies or Southies. And she's come up life, you know, she's had serious knocks. We're in the 1970s. Their very white enclave is quite racist. It's very violent. There are drug lords. There's an Irish kind of mafia boss called Marty, who is a serious bit of trouble. He's a nasty piece of work. And Mary Pat herself has lost one son to the drugs already, and she's now got a young daughter, you know, a young adult, who has stayed out one night and doesn't come back. Now, there's a whole storyline about who she's seeing, who her mother thinks she's seeing, and what we can find out about that particular storyline. At the same time, there's another, and she goes missing, so Mary Pat wants to find out where she is. And she doesn't have a good feeling about this. At the same time, a young man is found murdered. Augustus, he's black, he's found murdered at a local station. And are these two things connected? There's a fairly, you know, respectable, quite nice, interestingly drawn detective called Coyle who's looking into all of this. It's set against the laws that were changing over segregation. So it was high schools were going to, this was the first time high schools were going to integrate the white with the blacks. And there was a huge amount of resistance to this, even in Boston. And Lehane is sort of bringing that story to light while he pops these characters into that particular background. I suppose the standout of this novel for me is Mary Pat herself. She is larger than life, but of course Lehane credits us all with, you know, more intelligence than just saying these are the goodies, these are the baddies, as I think most writers do. I mean, we like to feel safe with our characters, but in this one you never really know, because even Mary Pat herself, having lived all her life in this environment, golly, she's a brutal piece of work. She's, you know, she'll give as good as she gets. She's a toughie. And also, because this story with her daughter it's all she has, she really has nothing to lose when she's on the rampage for finding out what has happened to her daughter. He's an astonishing writer. If you've never read him, you might need a brandy, but boy, it's worth it. Two more. History. Number one, we have got, which comes to us from Simon Schuster, Susan Paterson's Where Light Meets Water. Now this one is a debut fiction. It's set between Australia, London, and some New Zealand, and of course on the sea, if you like. We have, and set in the 1840s. It's a book about sailing or being a seaman on the tall ships. So we have two main characters really. We've got Tom Rutherford, who's come from a poor background, and once his father had died at sea, the captain of the ship that he crewed on offers a place to Tom, and Tom begins to adapt to a life at sea, and his ambition in life is to captain his own ship. At the same time, while he's at sea, and these descriptions of of how very risky it was in those days to be part of a crew and to sort of, come into a storm, and how you saved yourself and saved others, or you didn't and you went overboard or whatever. But this sort of being exposed to the elements, he's painted all the time. He paints what he feels about the sea and what he sees, his impressions. So we're in an impressionist kind of artistic feel. And Tom anyway, I'm not going to go too much into that, because he comes to land in England. The boat is put into dock because it needs some repairs, and he finds himself on the hills overlooking the Thames, and this way comes across Catherine Ogilvy, who is the daughter of a local lord. She's gentry. And they are both, she's intrigued by the fact that he's drawing. He's very intrigued by her. The intrigue will obviously turn to love. But they're both coming from a background where they are, if you like, presuming something. He's not dabbling in art, and she's not painting as an accomplishment to make herself more marriageable. They both want to express something. And they both look and learn from each other's way of expressing and how they do it. And they both recognize a potential in the other. I found this a very leisurely, not sedate, I don't think, because there's a lot of pace in the way her family deals with him, the fact that she's going to take a punt or a risk and sort of try and make a life with him, and then his time away from her when he's at sea, and how the fact that they're both trying to be something that society has decided they shouldn't be. It's not just about women in Victorian England. It's also about, poor people. So it's how society has decided certain behaviours or certain aspirations. You shouldn't have them, but they do. And what happens? I will leave you to read it to find out, but it's very descriptive and very delicately drawn in places, but there's a lot of strength in the work at sea. It was very beautifully written, very much enjoyed and highly recommend. Different pace. And a last one, which is Robyn Cadwallader's The Fire and the Rose. And this comes to us from HarperCollins. And this is another piece of historical fiction. Cadwallader's done two before, The Anchoress and The Book of Colours. And in both of these we are dealing with, she does focus on the female, and again, what the female wants for herself, which she shouldn't be wanting. In this one, we have a young woman called Eleanor, and Eleanor has come from rural England, where she leaves a there's a backstory, which is not essential, but she eventually leaves her rural setting and she comes to Lincoln, which is a thriving wool town mostly. And she comes as a housemaid, and it is noticed by her master, who is a wool grower and buyer, that she is lettered, so she can read and write, and he allows her to do his accounting for him. And she particularly would like to become a scribe. She'd like to work with ink and parchment, and this is a big no-no. She's ridiculed and told to not even want this. She's birthmarked, so you think that you get this theme going on about outcasts. Now, talking about outcasts in this town of Lincoln, and we're in the 13th century, the Jewish community is constantly sort of shunted to one side, and they very much, keep to themselves because they have learned to. They're at the mercy of a king who may or may not want them to be chucked in prison or not, because of their only legal or allowed profession is usury, or money lending. And the rest of society shuns them, not only because, they're Jews, but also Jews have very bad practices, one of which develops into this narrative that the town adopts, and definitely the local church adopts, which is that a young boy had been lured into one of the fancy households of these Jewish families, like they retained their riches, and had been possibly tortured and then chucked out, and he died. And the church takes up this story, makes a martyr of him, and there's huge hostility. The town thinks Jews are all bad. Eleanor meets a young girl, same age, Jewish, a spice merchant, or he's an apprentice, and they fall in love. There is a child of this union, but of course it can't be sanctioned by anybody. So it's also a time where a woman, if she wanted to bring up her child, could say, well, I don't want to tell you the fathers, I don't even know who he is, and there's no big deal about this. But Cadwallader writes with great detail. Her research is absolutely impeccable. Her storyline is romantic to a certain extent, but it's also you feel there's a great pragmatism about how Eleanor sort of deals with having a child, not being telling them or not, how her friendship in the Jewish community, how it's viewed, and Cadwallader allows we have that way of saying, if the stones could talk, what are the stories they would tell? And she allows at regular intervals the stones to sing out the story of what this town is like and what the people suffer. It's a very richly detailed, beautifully drawn story. And if you're a fan of a great story, you get that amazing part of history that I didn't really know. It's not one to miss. There you go. That is my 7-book lineup for today. Thank you for listening, and I will see you again soon.
You're like a song that I sing in the morning on a perfect holiday. You're like the warmth of the sun on my skin when clouds look gray.